Good morning, all of you. Today we have Dr. Anish Koshy from English and Foreign Language University, Hyderabad. The only one university which is actually focusing on language teaching and training. I'm so happy that today we have Dr. Anish Koshy with us. He needs an introduction because I know there were visits from our institute to CFL, and the Vice Chancellors of CFL also visited our college. But thereafter there was a gap, long gap between, for many years there was a gap. So I'm so happy to introduce Dr. Anish Koshy, representing English and Foreign Language University. I'm lucky that I was also a student of the same university for my PhD diploma. Dr. Anish, when I talked to him, he readily agreed to take a session for the benefit of the students of Gujarat who pursue B.Ed English. Dr. Anish is a product of JNU. He has his PhD from JNU Linguistics and has more than 10 years experience in teaching linguistics at EFLU, especially guiding PGCT programs, postgraduate certificate in teaching English. Sir has actually published a number of articles and books and reviewed many books in linguistics, contributed a lot in the area of linguistics, and especially writing materials for the UGC e-Pathshala. E-content, I hope he has written a number of e-content and modules for that. Also, he often works with Ambedkar University in materials production and guiding, the scholars. I'm so happy to welcome him in this platform, and we won't allow him to leave like that. We'll ask him to join again after sometime. Sir, welcome to this online ELT expert session organized by HMPIETR Institute of English Training and Research, Vallabh, Vidyanagar. Welcome, sir. Your mic is muted, sir. So please unmute your mic. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Bose, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak to your students at the HMPIETR Institute for English Training and Research. I was not very sure what I should be speaking on, but then Dr. Bose said that it could be introductory in nature. And then he also sent me the syllabus for one of the courses, which includes some modules in linguistics. So I thought I will combine this talk to give the students and the audience an introduction to the field of linguistics. And by way of introduction, I mean to the various branches of linguistics and how we could possibly think about connecting linguistics to the field of language teaching in general and English language teaching in particular. I am Anish Koshy. I belong to the Department of Linguistics and Phonetics at the English and Foreign Languages University, Hyderabad. And it is my privilege and pleasure today to be speaking to this audience. So when I try to think about linguistics and I try to connect it with the field of language teaching, which possibly is a common and a general concern that most of you have with respect to the training that you are undergoing at this moment. So when we talk about linguistics and language teaching, we are possibly looking at the role of the study of language structure, because when you try to define linguistics as an adventure or as a field that tries to capture the nature of human language, we've had differences over the years. We've had differences over how we understand this whole phenomenon of human language and the structure of human language. And over the years, how we've understood the nature of human language has also influenced our idea of how it should be taught in a first language context or in a second language context. So therefore, when you learn linguistics, keep an open mind about the ideas, because it has been a very difficult idea to capture in the first place. For centuries now, we've been dealing with human language, and we've had various ways of understanding human language. To the common person on the street, if you were to ask that person what is language, they are very likely to tell you it's a means of communication. And that has been the most standard and the most common way of understanding language. But linguistics, of course, has looked at language in more detail than what just communication or communicative needs define human language. And that, in a way, has also defined for us how we teach the human languages. Of course, linguistics also has a lot to inform you about the various acrimonious debates on what is the correct usage of language. Especially English teachers who go into the classroom are very often people who tell students this is correct and this is not correct. So, what does linguistics tell us about these questions on usage is also something that we learn when we do linguistics. And of course, the field of linguistics has been quite a broad field. It has had its influence and its interactions with various fields of inquiry that human beings have been involved in. Some of the fields that come to my mind very readily is the field of computers, for example. We all are so ubiquitously dependent on computers today. We started the day today wasting 15 minutes trying to understand why the computer could not understand our language. We wanted it to present the PPT, but it refused to understand our language. Now, the whole idea of computer language, of course, comes from human language. And it has always been our endeavor, over the centuries, or over at least the last century, or at least the last few decades, to try to teach the computers to understand human language. We want artificial intelligence surrounding us today. We have artificial intelligence surrounding us today. So you can take up your Android phone and speak to your phone. You can talk to Siri on your Apple phones. The machine seems to understand you, seems to reply to you. So, how does this happen? This does not happen just because a bunch of engineers sit down to, write a computer program. It will never happen. This happened because there has been a large-scale interaction between the community of linguists and the community of engineers. Engineers know how to program, but they have zero idea about what human language is like. And if you want the computer to understand human language, you will have to tell the computer to think like a human. And if you want the computer to think like a human, then you have to know, how do human beings think? And that is where the matter comes to a crux. The layman on the street tells you human language is the means of communication. And here you have a bunch of linguists sitting and wondering, how do human beings think? Because we want to make machines think like human beings. But we have to first know how human beings think. And that question has led to such revolutionary ideas in the field of linguistics, because more and more we have come to realize that we are so dependent on our human language for our ability to think. At least for every higher order thinking, we just cannot do it without our language. Suppose you want to think about going to the nearest cafe. It's never really the case that you imagine only the roads. You tell yourself, okay, I will probably get up at this time, I'll close the door, I'll take the left, I'll take the right, and then I will see it on this side. The higher order thinking of human beings has been through human language, and therefore to make computers, which is the thing in today's world, think like human beings, we need to know how humans think, and that is so crucially through the field of linguistics. I was just elaborating on one of the fields where linguistics has had such a tremendous influence in our day-to-day life. Of course, there are more specialized fields where linguistics interacts with our day-to-day lives, like for example the area of language disorders, the area of lexicography, dictionary writing. There is also the area of language policy and social problems. We will look into this in a little more detail as we progress. There is the area of publishing, there is the area of translation, and then of course the specialization that most of you are in at HMPIETR Institute, the specialization in language teaching and testing. Of course, the kind of linguistic training that is involved for each of these interactions, whether it is the field of computers or language disorders or language teaching and testing, publishing or lexicography, the training, of course, tends to be very, very different. Of course, when we think about linguistics for language teachers, we are talking about two different types of language teachers and the kind of impact that linguistic training can have for each of these groups of language teachers. The first group that, of course, we are thinking about are the first language teachers, right? And the second group that we are thinking about are those language teachers who teach language in a second or a foreign language context. So we have English as first language, English as second language, English as a foreign language, all kinds of contexts. And a teacher who is trained in linguistics goes to these language teaching contexts from a very different training and with a very different perspective. So there is a lot that the language teacher knows and imparts to students trained after being trained in linguistics whose first language is English. And we will come to know what probably those things that teachers get trained in are. Of course, when it comes to a second language context, there is a big role for explicit linguistic instruction, especially grammar instruction. And how do teachers who are trained in linguistics deal with a second language context? So in order to understand what kind of a training linguistics gives language teachers and how it helps language teachers in their specific context of first language teaching or second or foreign language teaching, I want to take you through the different branches of linguistics to begin with. Of course, when we talk about branches of linguistics, we need to be very clear on what exactly do we mean by linguistics in the first place, right? And I'm sure most of you have been introduced to some aspects of linguistics at least, and therefore you are probably aware of what is linguistics. Of course, the most simple definition for linguistics would be it is the scientific study of human language. Scientific because it is in the methodology of the study that the scientific methodology comes in, and it is the study of human language. And when we say it is the scientific study of human language, we understand what scientific means. I said scientific is the methodology of study, where you have to observe data. Then from the data that you observe, you form a hypothesis. And then on the basis of the hypotheses, you go back to where the data is and test your hypothesis against more data. You need validation for your hypothesis. And if additional data confirms your hypothesis, then you have a theory. And you have a theory of language in our case. So it is a scientific study of language because the methodology is scientific. That's how you study phenomenon in physics or chemistry or biology, any of your typical sciences that you know of. Now, when we say it's the scientific study of language, we also need to understand that language is not just grammar. You know, that's the common misconception that most people have, that when you say linguistics or when you say scientific study of language, language is grammar. No, language is not just grammar. And even if you were to say language is grammar, what kind of grammar are you talking about? Because when you try to define grammar, you would say grammar is a set of rules, right? Set of rules which tell you what is correct and what is incorrect, or how to use language correctly. We call it the grammar. Of course, the word grammar has been now adopted into various fields, and we say grammar of this and grammar of music, grammar of many other things. So grammar is basically a set of rules. But most people think that when we are talking about grammar and set of rules, we are talking about just the kind of set of rules that you find in those boring books like Wren and Martin. Of course, I am not trying to put down Wren and Martin. It has been a very useful grammar book for many, many school teachers. Even I was taught using that particular book in my school, but it's a very dry book. And most people have this conception of grammar and linguistics as very dry because they have only read Wren and Martin. Well, grammar is not just a set of rules that you find in books like Wren and Martin. And therefore, when linguistics defines itself as a scientific study of language, we are not just talking about writing rules like the rules written in Wren and Martin. We are trying to look at the study of the structure of language from its smallest unit to its largest unit. And then, of course, the question is, what is the smallest unit of significance in a language, and what could be the largest unit of significance in a human language? And when we try to do linguistics and we do a scientific study, what we are also saying is that there is something that can be studied scientifically, right? Now, many people think that language is just an arbitrary bunch of things, right? That you study grammar from Wren and Martin and you think that you know everything in English grammar, and you try to use English like it is in Wren and Martin, and then you see that no, Wren and Martin does not capture everything. And so people have this perception that, well, many things happen in language which you cannot explain, and therefore language must all be just random. Is language like mathematics? Some people ask. If you say a scientific study of language, can you study language like you study mathematics? Will you have no exceptions to the rules? So, you know, these questions, of course, keep linguists on their toes and keeps the field of linguistics ever more in an endeavor to try to see what the underlying patterns and systems and structures are in human language. And therefore, when we say linguistics and the scientific study of language, try to understand that it is an endeavor to try to study language as precisely as possible, from its smallest unit of significance to its largest unit of significance, assuming that language has a structure and that everything that happens in language is part of a structure-dependent system. Why is this important? Is because if you were to assume that language is just an arbitrary bunch of rules and exceptions, then you will have nothing to study. Then you will have nothing to go out and investigate, because you will have a bunch of structures, you will hypothesize, you will write the rules, but you will find that these rules are broken as and when people want to break them. There is no system. That kind of a study of language does not work. So we have to assume in linguistics that language is structure dependent, and that everything that happens in language happens in a very methodical manner. That nothing that happens in language is arbitrary. Everything in language has a reason. So when we study linguistics, we are not only inquiring the structure of language, but also trying to inquire why things are as they are. Now, this is a very important point, because if you are to become a language teacher and you go to a classroom, your students will have both these questions. Number one, teacher, how do we say this, right? And of course, trained in linguistics, having read Wren and Martin, etc., you will tell them, all right, this is the rule, this is how you do it. But students and their curiosity does not end there. Very often they will ask you why. Why is it so in the language? Why? Not just how, but also the why. And remember that linguistics endeavors to capture both these aspects of language. One, inquiring the structure of language. Other, trying to find explanations for why things are as they are in language. All right, let me start this discussion by taking you through, as I know the teachers probably already know these things, but I am trying to focus the lecture on the students who are attending, and therefore I want to take you through the branches of linguistics. One of the most basic branch of linguistics, as we say, is phonetics. Phonetics is the study of sounds in human languages. Now, when I said that linguistics is a systematic scientific study from the smallest unit of significance to the largest unit of significance, the smallest unit of significance in a human language is the sounds that we make as part of our ability to speak a human language. So the bottom line where we start our investigation into human language is from phonetics, the study of sounds in human language. Of course, phonetics is very general. It deals with all kinds of possible and impossible sounds in human languages. So we have a set inventory. We don't go out of this inventory. The International Phonetic Association, the IPA, does this job of classifying all human languages and the sounds in all human languages into a very neat table. So we have our limits that we have. Our human sounds always begin with our lips and they go all the way down up to the glottis. So all human languages, there are more than 6,000 human languages. And all these 6,000 human languages make use of just this space of our human anatomy, from the lips up to the vocal cords or the glottis. And they produce a myriad of sounds with nasalization, without nasalization, all kinds of combinations, and give us this extreme diversity that we know of in terms of human language. More than 6,000 plus human language, India itself being home to more than 1,500 human languages. The first branch that we were talking about in linguistics is that of phonetics, where we try to understand the limits and the extent of human sound, the ability to produce sounds. But more importantly is the next branch of linguistics in the hierarchy. If you were to place them in a hierarchical order, of course, at the bottom you would have phonetics, and then at the next level you would have phonology. What do we do in phonology? And this is important for teachers of English and future teachers of English. What do we do in phonology? In phonology, we study the phonotactics of a language, and we study the segmental and the suprasegmental features of a language, like stress, rhythm, intonation, etc. What do we mean by phonotactics? Now, it's one thing to say that we have these many sounds in our inventory, and that in a particular language we have these sounds. But there are rules which determine how sounds combine with each other in a particular language. And therefore, as you teach English, you should be aware both of the phonotactics of English as it is, as well as that of the language that the children come to your classrooms with. They are all masters in their mother tongue by the age of 4. And so when you are teaching them, they already know at least one language, which is their mother tongue. And if you are teaching in a context where most people speak the same kind of mother tongue, as a language teacher, you must first become a phonologist. That is, you must work out how do the phonotactics of this mother tongue works, and how is it different from the phonotactics of English. What kind of combinations are possible in English which may not be possible in the mother tongue of my learners, and therefore how should I go about helping them? One very, very common example that we find is how English allows many kinds of consonant clusters. Circa, serpa, certa, there are words like spoon and station and school, etc., where you can have clusters at the beginning of words, of course also at the end of words. Now there are many languages which do not like clusters, and therefore when you go into a classroom where your students speak a language which do not allow clusters, you're probably not going to hear station but station or satation. You're probably not going to hear school, rather iskul or sakul, or ispoon or sapoon. And that, you should know, is not really your children unwilling to learn English, but the mother tongue having a very strong say. And as language teachers trained in linguistics, you should be able to help your students. And that is one of the ways in which formal training in linguistics, I'm talking about formal, these are formal branches of linguistics, and how formal training in linguistics can go a long way in you becoming better English teachers. Similarly, the segmental and suprasegmental features. How does the English stress system work? How does rhythm work in English? What kind of an intonation does English prefer to use? These are aspects of the language that you get formally trained in when you do linguistics, which you could use in your English language classroom. The next branch we talk about is morphology. This is a branch where individual sounds now combine to form meaningful units. When I said sk or sp or st in words like school or spoon or station in English, these combinations of sounds don't have any meanings. They are important as units of sounds, but they are not important as units of meaning. The smallest units of meaning in language gets studied in this branch of linguistics called morphology. And the word morphology, of course, itself is formed by morph and logi, logi being study, and morph meaning shapes. The study of shapes. What kind of shapes? The minimum meaningful shapes in a language. So in this, you will have to study forms not just like proper and balance, but also which forms imbalance or improper. And of course, when you study them in combination with phonology, you will realize that the sounds in, ing are all the same, except that they are influenced by neighboring sounds. So minimum meaningful units of language. And of course, you will also know when your children make mistakes. Like, for example, the plural form is the study of morphology. But you also know that in English, unlike a language like Hindi or Gujarati for that matter, it's not a regular system of plural formation. We have a lot of irregular plural forms in English, and therefore trained in morphology, you should be able to tell your children about regular and irregular forms in English. You might also want to talk about irregular forms even in a language like Hindi. If you are trained in linguistics, you would be aware that Hindi also has a lot of irregular forms that you could tell your students about. So for example, when you have good, better, and best, your children might wonder why it is not gooder and goodest. And then you tell them about something called suppletion in linguistics, which happens in languages like English. And if your children begin to feel that suppletion is something very exotic in English, you could tell them what happens in Hindi too. In Hindi, you have a present tense be form in hai. The past tense be form is tha or thi. The hai and the tha form have nothing to do with each other phonologically, just like good and better and best have nothing to do with each other phonologically. So suppletion, this is something that you would study in morphology, and you would be equipped to tell your children different interesting things about language. Of course, the next higher branch of linguistics is that of syntax. And in syntax, we study what is generally understood in common man's parlance as grammar. That is, the grammar of nouns and verbs and noun phrases and verb phrases and noun clauses and verb clauses and relative clauses and simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences, the kind of things that you are generally aware of in traditional grammars is what we study in linguistics under what is called syntax. But of course, in syntax, there is not only an attempt to describe the structures of phrases and clauses and sentences, but also trying to see if there are some very interesting underlying patterns. And in this context, if you do linguistics, you will read about concepts like the concept of hierarchy, the concept of recursion, concept of structure dependence, that nothing in grammar is arbitrary. Everything is defined by rule. And that is why there is this very famous saying that if you see an exception to a rule, that only goes to prove the rule, because as they say, exception proves the rule. You can only have an exception if there is a rule. If there is no rule, there is no exception. Everything is arbitrary. So that is why if you see that you have a rule and you find an exception, syntax will try to understand that exception and try to explain that exception. The next branch of linguistics that you probably would get to know if you are trained in linguistics is that of semantics. Semantics is the study of meaning, and it is also the study of the principles of human organization. You know, meaning is one of the most difficult things to understand in human language. We have dictionaries, of course, and we have never had to think very deeply about How do we convey or communicate meaning? How do we understand the meaning of items? And how do we organize words in terms of their meanings in our mental lexicon? A dictionary is one thing where you will have a very linear alphabetical listing of all the possible words and forms in the language. But when you think about your own dictionary in your head, you have a dictionary here in your head, which is called the mental lexicon. How do you organize words? Do you list words like it is in a dictionary? Does it look very economical to you? Or would you think that you have some principles of organization? Is there a better way of organizing? Do we, like for example, put words like man, woman, he, she, boy, girl, grandfather, grandmother, all in one category because we know these are humans and these are, or words like uncle, aunt, husband, wife, grandfather, grandmother, together because they are all definitions of relationships? Or do you think you list them, father where F comes and mother where M comes and grandfather where G comes and uncle where U comes? That doesn't make sense. In terms of a mental lexicon, it makes more sense for us to put uncle and father next to each other, mother and uncle, brother and sister, cousin and nephew in the same place, because that system of organization is more economical. So semantics will tell us not just about how meanings of expressions come about, but also that we have probably a very, very interesting system of organizing words in our mental lexicon. Pragmatics is the study of context-dependent meaning, because in our day-to-day communication and use of language, we know that when we use language, we don't always mean what we say. And people with whom we communicate always very well understand that we don't mean what we say. And this is something which is studied under pragmatics, where, words and expressions get context-dependent meaning. So, for example, you told your wife that you were going to return home by 8 in the evening. She prepares some lovely dinner for you and she is waiting for you. You arrive at 10 o'clock in the night and you haven't eaten anything. You were caught up somewhere, fine. You tell your wife, I'm hungry, and your wife says, I have cleaned the table. Did she tell you anything? Did she mean that she has completed the task of cleaning the table? Or did she have something more to tell you? Of course, any of us who know to use language, we know that when you told her you were hungry at 10 o'clock when you were supposed to come at 8 o'clock, and she tells you, I have cleaned up the table, you know what she means. So there is meaning of words, and there is meaning of words beyond the meaning of words, which comes from context. And this is something that gets studied in pragmatics. Then, of course, a very important branch of linguistics, which is sociolinguistics. In sociolinguistics, we study the connections between language and society. And when we study the relationship between language and society, we understand that there is a lot of power politics that is at play in every human society with respect to which language gets promoted and supported and highlighted. I told you some time back that India is home to close to 1,500 languages. How many of these are recognized by the Constitution of India? How many of them get reported in the census of India? Who takes these decisions? Whose languages are represented in the Constitution of India? Whose languages get left out? These are not decided on the merits of language. I mean, if you do sociolinguistics, you will soon realize that the decision on which language to include in the Constitution of India, Schedule 8, is not dependent on the qualities of a language. It is dependent on a lot of power politics. And therefore, when the Republic of India was born in 1950, 26 January, we included 14 languages. And then after a gap of 15 plus years, we included one more language, making it 15. And then towards the 1990s, we added 3 more. We made it 18. And then in the beginning of the 21st century, 2001-2, we added 4 more languages. And finally, having started with 14 languages in 1950, we now have 22 languages in the 8th schedule of the Constitution. Now the question is, what is so special about these 22? And what wrong did the other 1,478 languages do to be not included in the Constitution of India? So, you know, what gets defined as language, who defines a dialect, and what is exactly a dialect are all very, very political questions and are determined by who has power to determine these factors. And therefore, when you go into a classroom, be very empathetic, be very sympathetic to the fact that in your classroom you will have people who speak languages that are supported by the state as their mother tongue. There will be students who speak languages which are not supported by the state, for whom the language that is supported by the state is not the first language, is the second language. And therefore, their disadvantage is double than those who don't speak English but speak a language which is supported by the state. So sociolinguistics makes the language teacher very, very conscious and aware of the dynamics of the power politics that define languages in a country or a culture. Then we have other branches of linguistics like cognitive linguistics and psycholinguistics. This is a branch which studies how we acquire or learn language, process language, and understand meaning. Of course, the theories of psycholinguistics have been very influential in the field of language teaching as well, because what do we know about human language and how we acquire and learn human language has played a very important role in our understanding of how should we teach human language. So there was a time when for a long time we thought that human language was learned by practice. That is, children are born and then, you know, mothers and parents have to speak to children continuously, and it is based on this feedback that children learn language. And therefore, this inspired a particular idea of how should we go about doing language teaching in the classroom. Then came other linguists who said, well, that does not seem to be the entire picture. There seems to be inborn abilities for human language, etc. And that had a definite influence on how we try to understand language teaching. We will look into this in more detail as we look at these specific branches of linguistics. The next branch of linguistics is neurolinguistics or clinical linguistics. In this, we study how our human brain is wired for language. And this helps us especially in the field of language disorders. When clinically we find that people have medical conditions that make it difficult for them to use language normally, because of our studies in neurolinguistics and clinical linguistics, we try to investigate which part of the brain is affected. And then we try to come up with a therapy or a treatment that would try to rectify the kind of problems that people have. The next branch, of course, is that of historical comparative linguistics. We study the history of languages. We compare languages as they exist today with their near relatives. We study the origins of languages, and we study about one of the very, very fascinating things in languages known as borrowings. What the study of origins and borrowings tell us about human language is that no human language in the world can claim status of being a very pure language. No language is pure. And there is nothing called a pure language anywhere in the world, because every language in the world has borrowed words, structures from different languages. And of course, when you investigate the origins of languages, you come to such fascinating aspects of languages that you probably would have never thought about. Let's think about the context of India, for example. You know, there is this absolute misunderstanding among people in India that Sanskrit is the mother of all Indian languages. The reality is that, forget about not being the mother of all Indian languages, Sanskrit is not even the oldest Indian language that is spoken in India. Yet, the influence of Sanskrit has been so great on all the literary languages of India that it has often been assumed that Sanskrit should have been or could have been the mother of all Indian languages. Of course, the Dravidian languages have nothing to do with Sanskrit. The Austroasiatic languages of India, Munda languages, the Mon Khmer languages of Meghalaya have nothing to do with Sanskrit. The Tibeto-Burman languages, part of the Sino-Tibetan family, spoken in the northeast of India, have nothing to do with Sanskrit. The only languages that have got to do with Sanskrit are the languages spoken in north and northwestern and northeastern parts of India, basically the Indo-Aryan languages. Yet we find that Sanskrit has had a great influence on the Dravidian literary languages. Quite a lot of words, for example, in Malayalam and in Telugu are borrowed from Sanskrit. But has Sanskrit borrowed anything from these languages? Of course, Sanskrit has also borrowed quite a lot from these languages. One of the most important things that Sanskrit has probably borrowed is its very structure. You know, Sanskrit belongs to, or Hindi and Bangla and Gujarati, they all belong to a family of languages called Indo-Aryan, and the higher branch is Indo-European. Now, Indo-European has other branches like Germanic, it has Indo-Iranian, it has Romance languages, it has Celtic languages, many different branches. Indo-Aryan is just one of the branches of Indo-European. English, for that matter, is a sister, a distant sister to Hindi in that sense. And that is why when you found suppletion in English in good and better, you found suppletion in Hindi as well, in hai and tha. You don't find suppletion in Dravidian languages. You don't find suppletion in Tibeto-Burman languages. You don't find suppletion in the Munda languages. So there is a very, very vast connection, a very old connection that exists between these languages, and historical comparative linguistics is an attempt to study that. Now, for language teachers, why historical comparative linguistics becomes important is because a lot of questions that your students are going to ask you in the classroom in terms of why is the past tense of put, put? Why is the past tense of burn, burnt, and the like? The answer to all these questions are not going to be in Wren and Martin. The answers to all these questions are going to be on the history of the English language. And for that, if you have a good training in historical comparative linguistics, you will have the answers to many of the questions that come from the history of English language. Then there are other branches like typological linguistics, which study the patterns of languages across languages. So you look at structures across languages, and what fascinates us in typological linguistics is that we find that human languages are different from each other but this variation is not random. There is a pattern to the way human languages are, different. And this is to be expected. If we believe in the science that human beings had a common single origin, we have the out of Africa theory, which is the strongest in biological sciences to explain the origin of the human species, that somewhere we evolved in Africa and then we came out and we populated different parts of the world. Then it should be also the case that human language also at some point of time was a single language, and then it diversified into the 6,000 types that we know of today. So when in typological linguistics we try to study patterns, what we realize is that yes, there is an underlying similarity that exists across languages which can be studied, and we can go back to the roots of human languages. Areal linguistics studies languages as they exist in a particular geography and as their connections are formed in a particular geography. Now, areal linguistics is important, for example, in the context of Indian English. Indian English is very different from British English, American English, Australian English. Of course, the native speakers are very hesitant to acknowledge and recognize Indian English as, a distinct variety of English. Of course, today there is a lot more and larger acceptance to Indian English. Now, what makes Indian English is the fact that it is spoken in India, right? And this is areal linguistics. That is, there is an influence of the geography, not in terms of the geography in terms of rivers and mountains, but in terms of what are the other languages that are spoken in this particular geographical region and what kind of an influence it has on English. So that's an important thing that we should know when we go to an English classroom. Now, having looked at these various branches of linguistics, I want to focus on three major branches or schools of linguistics, as you can say, which has had a very major influence in the field of language teaching as well. The first one is that of structural linguistics or descriptive linguistics. Structural linguistics or descriptive linguistics starts with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure and Leonard Bloomfield, and they look at language as a system of interrelated structures. So what they're saying is that language consists of building blocks, and you have to know how to place these building blocks next to each other, form the foundation, and from the foundation you form the next level of building blocks and go on building languages hierarchically in a very structured manner. So in structural or descriptive linguistics, it's very important to identify the syntactic and lexical forms correctly, and then to be able to use the forms of language correctly. This field of linguistics, or this school of linguistic thought, has had a major influence on what is called the behaviorist theory of language acquisition. In the behaviorist theory of language acquisition, language is looked upon as a behavior, as a habit formation. The more you practice the structures, remember, it is structural linguistics. So the more you practice these structures, you will form a habit of using these structures strongly. And as you go on practicing and building these structures, you will be able to use language correctly. This is the behaviorist school, and from this came various kinds of practices in language teaching, like for example the drill method where you give them a set of structures of the same type, and so you say this is dash, fill it, this is a boy, this is a class, this is a glass, this is, so the drill method. This is habit formation, and habit formation of structures inspired by the structural school of linguistics. The next branch of linguistics that we want to talk about is that of generative linguistics. Generative linguistics is associated with one of the foremost thinkers of modern days, Noam Avram Chomsky. And what Chomsky came with is the idea that all of human language and its acquisition and learning is not really from outside. You know, when you say drilling and practicing and, you know, making a habit of language by the behaviorist models, what you're trying to say is that all language learning lies outside. The more you practice, the better you will become with language. What Chomsky came with, and it was a very revolutionary idea and continues to be one, is that human language is too complicated to be acquired by a child at the age that the child acquires human language. At what age do children acquire human language, you might ask? And you would be surprised if you have not observed children, that children begin to speak at the age of 1. They start speaking at the age of 1. Initially, of course, they speak only one-word sentences, which is what is called the telegram stage, where for anything they want, they would use only one word, like, you know, water, water, moon, blue, ball, etc. And then exponentially, they will, within the span of 2 to 3 to 4 years, they will start speaking. So from the beginning, when you are so excited that children are speaking one word that you are so excited about, they start speaking so much that you start getting irritated because they want to know why. They keep asking you this why at the age of 3 and 4, and they have acquired their mother tongue perfectly. There's only very little that is left. Only vocabulary is something that is left. The grammar is already there. At the age of 4, you know, at the age of 4, children can't even dress themselves properly. If you leave them with a pair of shoes and ask them to wear it, most of the times the left shoe would be on the right shoe and the right shoe would be on the left leg. It is this age where they acquire the grammar of their mother tongue. The same mother tongue, which when you teach to adults, takes them years and years to master, and sometimes they fail to do so even after years. When you go to the classroom and you teach English in a second language and foreign language context, you will realize this. No matter how many years you teach, some of them will never learn the language. Such a complicated grammar. Children at the age of 4, whose mother tongue is English, use it with absolute ease. Chomsky asked, how do you think this is possible? Do you think this is possible if they were trying to learn it from the environment? They can't even learn how to wear their shoes. They can't even eat their food properly. The food goes into their mouth and half of it falls on their lap. At that age, they are able to use language. And Chomsky asks, how do you think this is possible? Do you think it is possible if they did not have help? Do you think it is possible if they had to first understand the human language? Because no mother knows the grammar of English, okay? Nor the grammar of Hindi or Bangla or Gujarati. You just speak. And you are expecting the child to decipher the grammar from what they hear. Chomsky says it's not possible unless they have help. And so Chomsky came up with the theory that language is an innate ability that you are born with. You are born with the ability for human language, which no other species, not even our closest species are born with. It must be a genetic modification. There must be a human gene, and we are able to use language. And this theory that it's not always nurture, but that there is a big role to nature. The nature versus nurture theory, which is part of the nativist approaches to language acquisition, where they tell you that it's not just by nurture, it's not just because you taught human language to a child, but because naturally the child had the ability for language, that the child has acquired the language. That is Chomsky's theory, and that comes from the generative branch of linguistics. I will, because we are running out of time, I will just talk about one last branch of linguistics and I'll close, and how it has also had a major influence in the field of language teaching. The last branch of linguistics that I want to talk about is that of functional linguistics. The functional linguistics branch says, well, it's all right to talk about structures of human language, but what about the function of human language? Is that not important? Why do most people whom we ask what is language say that language is a means of communication? Why doesn't anybody say language is a bunch of nouns and verbs and adjectives and adverbs which are combined using conjunctions and prepositions? Why doesn't even a single human being outside who hasn't done grammar and linguistics define language on the basis of the structure? Why doesn't anybody say language is a bunch of sounds that we make? Why do people say that language is a means of communication? Now that is where the functional linguistics come in. They say that for most people, language is not defined in terms of the structure, but in terms of the function of the structures. That is, what is more important to know is not how to form the passive in a language, but to know what is the passive used for in the language. To define structure in terms of the function to which it is put, not vice versa. Not trying to teach children in a vacuum, this is active voice, this is passive voice, the subject becomes the object becomes the subject. It is all juggling. What kind of juggling is it? This is because the grammar teacher knows what they are talking about. It doesn't make sense to children. So what the functional linguists say is that the basic purpose of human language is communication. And therefore, any approach to studying language should begin with the function of language, should begin with what is language used for. And then once you have understood what is language used for, it should be possible for you to go back and see how do you use language for this particular function. So this has inspired, of course, today, and functional linguistics, of course, has had many proponents. If you had only Saussure and Bloomfield in structural linguistics and Chomsky in generative linguistics, functional linguistics is like the Protestant church, as they say. When you protest against Roman Catholic Church, you leave the Roman Catholic Church with a Pope, which is Noam Chomsky, and then everyone who opposes Noam Chomsky forms the Protestant church. And so you have too many functional linguists. You have Roman Jakobsen, William Halliday, Johanna Nichols, Joseph Greenberg, so many of them. But what is important is to understand what functional linguists are trying to say. They are saying, look at the function of language and try to go back to structure. This has inspired a very, very important field of language teaching today, which is called the communicative approach to language teaching, or CALT, which is very, very popular in the West, not so much in India, but so very popular in the West. And the communicative approach basically says this: let children speak. And when they want to speak about something, that is, they have a function, and they do not know how to speak or how to express that, that's when you tell them the structure. That's when you teach the grammar by trying to tell them, see, you can use the passive, for example, for something in Hindi, in Gujarati, in English, and then this is how you would form the passive in your mother tongue. So this is something that has inspired one of the very, very important fields today in language teaching. So let me now just conclude, because we have run out of time and I'm sorry to have kept you waiting for an additional 6 minutes. So as language teachers trained in linguistics, and you go into an English classroom, move away from a prescriptive approach. Try to understand what your children are speaking and try to join with them, not at a prescriptive level, but with more understanding of the principles of language structure and language use. Always recognize that every child you see in the classroom is already a master of one or more language that he or she uses as a mother tongue. As an English teacher, you should be able, and somebody who is trained in linguistics, you should be able to ask if you can use this knowledge that children already possess. Try to make language learning fun. We call linguistics the scientific study of language because it has a scientific methodology. Children enjoy the scientific methodology. They love to observe. Give them a set of sentences. Ask them to observe the patterns. Ask them to come up with a hypothesis or a rule describing those sentences. Give them an additional set of sentences and ask them to test the rule that they formed. Always remember, children will remember the rules that they have formed on their own by this fun method all their life, much more than the rules that you teach by writing them on the blackboard. And of course, always let them go in a field of discovery. The more you teach intermediate and advanced learners, keep this spirit of discovery alive in the language classroom, and you will find that your training in linguistics will come in very handy for you as a language teacher. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Your friend. So I hope that can we accommodate some of the students to ask questions over here?
Sure.
If they have any.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, please, students, if you have any questions, please ask them. Feel free to ask the questions. Well, I hope that nobody's willing to ask questions.
I hope I was not too fast and people did understand what I was talking about.
Not at all. So, both sir, before I propose the vote of thanks, any reflections from your side, sir?
Since both sir had to leave for a meeting at Gandhinagar, and he has conveyed his regard, he has conveyed his best wishes, and he has been very much thankful to you, sir, Koshy sir, for spending your valuable time and enlightening the future teachers and of course the existing teachers of English language. Linguistics is something which is quite new to most of us, and it was really thought-provoking. At the same time, it was very hilarious to know how language works. Language is what language does, and the way you oriented all the audience to linguistics and then different branches of linguistics with suitable examples, that was something worth watching, and I loved attending your session, sir, and we are looking forward to having you again and again. And over to Mona, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mehul sir, for sharing your views on behalf of both, sir. And I have not much to say now because everything has been said by you. But I would surely say thank you very much, sir, that you readily agreed, to teach our students. And this is something that when a person from EFLU is there with us, then a sense of authenticity is there. And students would certainly find that we have learned from a person who is so much, who is a scholar in this field. Thank you very much, sir, for sharing your views, for spending this much time with us. And we hope that in future also, we shall be able to host you in the same manner.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to join you, and sorry for all the hiccups in the beginning.
Not an issue.
Not at all.